welcome to Sustainability Superheroes. In the last couple of episodes, we've talked to developers and landowners about working towards biodiversity net gain. We are continuing that theme today from a legal perspective. We're going to be digging into the obligations on developers and what they need to do to comply, and what landowners seeking to offer biodiversity land also need to do, as well as understanding the responsibilities of planning authorities and responsible bodies. Biodiversity net gain has been in consultation for many years, and mandatory BNG came into effect for larger planning applications on the 12th of February, and for smaller ones, the 2nd of April has also come into effect. National infrastructure, which is currently exempt, is expected to be incorporated from November 2025. I have with me today Angus Walker, partner at law firm BDB Pitmans. Angus has been a partner since 2007 and has specialised in planning aspects for large projects and has provided expertise on biodiversity for several years now. He is on the Office of Environmental Protection's expert panel and is a former board chair of the National Infrastructure Planning Association. So please give me a warm welcome to Angus. Angus, can you tell us a little bit more about BDB Pitmans and the work areas you specialise in?
Yes, sure. Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you for inviting me to speak to you today about BNG, my new favourite subject. So my firm, BDB Pitmans, is based in the southeast of England, but we do cover the whole country. We do all different types of law, but the team I'm in is the planning team, which is pretty large compared to other law firms. My day job until recently has been large infrastructure projects, but I'm taking a particular interest in biodiversity net gain and trying to understand as much as I can about it so I can advise clients accordingly.
Wonderful. Let's take this back to basics. Can you tell us how UK law is established and how it is then enforced?
Yes, of course. So biodiversity net gain as a concept was in the Environment Act 2021. That was passed by Parliament in November of that year. But it has only just come into actual force because, as is common with these acts of parliament, they bring them into force over time. And there was quite a lot of preparation needed for this new regime. So it's added a new schedule to the Town and Country Planning Regime, Planning Act 1990, if you really want to know. And the essence of BNG is that for all planning applications made from now the 2nd of April, so that's already in force. If you're not so small that it doesn't count, you will generally have to replace any habitat that the application, when built, will destroy with new habitat somewhere, which the value of the new habitat is at least 10% better than the habitat that's being lost. So it's not just no harm, it's actual positive gain. So it is quite an interesting idea.
But how long is this maintained for?
Yeah, the obligation to maintain the new habitat is for at least 30 years. So that is quite a big commitment. And that's on top of the time it takes to create the habitat as well. So 30 years only starts once you've created it. So if it takes a few years to create, that's even longer. Theoretically, the bulldozer would come in at the end of those 30 years and destroy it all, but I think the government doesn't really want that to happen. So it is quite a commitment, but it could be a money spinner for landowners and even for developers. They could have some benefits.
Presumably, very small developments, extensions to houses or permitted developments are exempt. So at what point are developments caught by the obligations? And are there any caveats?
Yes, there are a few caveats, of course. So as you say, very small developments do not have to provide BNG, and the legal list of exemptions is that householder developments don't. They have that has a special legal meaning, but it's basically things like extensions to existing houses. Self-build projects where you are building a new house that you're going to live in, up to 9 houses at once, that would not count. Anything to do with HS2, curiously, is not covered by BNG. And biodiversity sites themselves, although normally if you're creating a new habitat, it won't need planning permission because just planting seeds and trees and things doesn't require planning permission. If it was a more complicated habitat like allotments or something, that wouldn't need to provide its own BNG on top of the habitat. But probably the main exemption is a size one. It's that if the amount of habitat on the site that is going to be degraded is less than 25 square meters in size, then you don't have to provide BNG. But that's not a very big area. That's about a big living room, essentially, or 2 parking spaces, somebody told me. So it's going to catch a lot of applications.
And we mentioned there are 2 types of BNG, one for small site metric. How does that differ from the regular version of BNG?
Yes, if it's houses, if it's up to 9 houses, and if it's not houses, it's up to 1,000 square meters. Those came into force in April rather than February. The bigger sites are in February. They can take advantage of what's called the small sites biodiversity metric for calculating the value of the habitat, which is slightly simpler. It's actually not that much simpler. I've had a read of both of them. I'm not sure it's hugely simple, but another advantage is for the larger metric, you need a professional ecologist to do all the calculations, whereas for the smaller one, you don't. You just need someone with relevant expertise. So that may at least make it a bit cheaper.
5 square meters is really small, as you said, and could be part of a conversion impacting on the garden. Do we expect the full end-to-end process then to be the same for very small sites? Will developers still need that 30-year commit, or are there any alternative?
Essentially, you will officially need a 30-year commitment, yes, for however small, as long as you're above that 25 square meter threshold. However, there are various options for securing the commitment as a developer, open to you and the local planning authority to agree. 2 of them are legal agreements. They're either called Section 106 agreements, which planning people will be familiar with already, or a new thing called a conservation covenant, which is quite similar. But it can also be done through a condition attached to the planning permission, and that might be a simpler way of doing it. But you will have to have that commitment for 30 years, however big or small the development, as long as it's above that threshold.
And there are a few exemptions for larger national scale projects. What are they, and why do we need to wait till November 2025?
Well, this is my day job until BNG came along, so I understand this. For very large infrastructure projects, instead of applying for planning permission, they get a special consent called development consent under a different regime called the Planning Act 2008, which is when it came in. So that's things like power stations, airports, harbours, solar, if they're above 50 megawatts, solar farms, all sorts of infrastructure like that. The government's decided not to apply BNG to those projects until November next year, give them another over a year grace, because they are more complicated. They often cover, like a long railway or power line will cover several local authorities, and it's all going to get very complicated. So they're spending a bit more time to think about that. But in fact, in my experience, projects under this regime are already having to at least declare how much BNG they are providing, and it will probably count against them if they provide less than the 10% figure, even if it's not a legal obligation yet.
Okay. Now, planning law is far wider than biodiversity net gain. What are the key aspects, requirements from an environmental perspective, and how does BNG interact with other obligations?
Essentially, it sits additional to any existing obligations. No existing obligation is disappearing or changing. So larger projects that need environmental impact assessment, they will still have to do that. And if you're affecting bats or protected species, you still have to do that separately. And if you're affecting a very highly protected landscape, like an area of outstanding natural beauty or a triple SI or something, that all carries on. So this is a sort of layer on top of all that. You may make some, as a developer, make some savings in assessing the land. You could assess it for habitats under BNG at the same time as for all these other environmental obligations. So perhaps there's a bit of an economy there, but there's no legal saving really. Okay.
And does the local planning authority act as the enforcement agent for all planning associated with environmental requirements? Is there anything different?
Well, talking about all environmental requirements, some of them, for example, protected species, you need a license from Natural England or something, and they would police that. But for the planning application itself, it is all policed by the local authority, and certainly under Biodiversity Net Gain, it will be the local authority that will enforce the agreement that you are creating and in maintaining this habitat for 30 years. But I should point out that if you're in this regime, you don't have to do it yourself. You can pay someone else somewhere else to enhance, and we'll come on to this in a bit more detail, enhance some habitat. And then it isn't up to you. It won't be enforced against you, the developer. It will be enforced against that landowner and their local authority. Might not be the same local authority. They will be enforcing against them separately, and you will be out of the picture, which might be quite handy.
Okay. What powers do local planning authorities have? Can they require a developer to amend or add conditions to a plan in order to gain approval? Can they go above?
Certainly, at getting the approval stage, getting to approval, it's up to the local authority to add conditions. This legal regime has a mandatory condition that must be added to all eligible planning permissions to provide the 10% net gain. Sorry, what was the second half of your question?
Can they require a greater gain than 10%?
Oh, yes, that's right. Some local authorities do have policies for more than 10% biodiversity net gain. Although at the last minute, the government issued some guidance at the beginning of February that tried to discourage this, because I think they don't want to create an uneven playing field. So they say only local authorities should only have their own policies for a higher figure if they got very good justification for doing that. So I'm not sure what happens to the ones who've already got that policy. They're probably allowed to keep them, but new ones probably won't.
What happens if a developer fails to comply with that planning requirement for B&G?
Well, if it's on site, if it's on their own site, then they will be enforced against by the planning authority. If it was a condition attached to the planning permission, they'll be enforced for breach of condition. And if it's a Section 106 agreement, they'll be enforced for breaching that agreement, so as a contractual breach. But if it's the new style conservation covenant, that isn't entered into necessarily with the local planning authority. It's an organisation that has volunteered to be the other side of these agreements, called a responsible body. There are 5 of them available so far, not very many. So they would enforce in that case.
Okay. And what do local planning authorities require in order to approve a developer's B&G plan?
Well, there's 2 stages really. When you make the application as the developer, you have to say everything you can about the current site you're proposing to develop on. So you have to calculate all the different, maybe more than one type of habitat on there. There's a thing called the biodiversity metric that Natural England have produced that divides all types of land into, I think it's 130 something habitat of all different shapes and sizes, and each of them has a score. And so those habitats have to be. Oh, somebody's got a question. Shall I answer? Do you want to? You can handle the questions if they get lost.
Yep.
So yeah, slightly lost my thread. So that is at the point you make the application. You say what the habitats are on the site at the moment, and you can get as far as getting permission on that basis. But then before you can commence the development, you have to agree a document called a biodiversity gain plan with the local authority. And that sets out all the details of where the replacement habitat is going to come from. So it could be on-site, could be off-site, or there is this last resort called biodiversity credits, or it could be a combination of those. But that will all have to be set out in detail and agreed with the local authority before the development can start.
Terrific. And what obligations do local planning authorities have to monitor compliance to approved plans?
It'll probably be written in the agreement or the condition, the Section 106 agreement. I'm getting messages that you're quiet, Stephen. I hope it's not me as well.
Sure, how can I adjust my...
Yes, so it'll probably be written into the Section 106 agreement that the local authority will monitor that the habitat is being created on time and then being maintained and not just abandoned or whatever. And I imagine the Section 106 agreement will contain a provision that the developer pays the local authority for doing this monitoring. So expect some money to change hands there. And it'll tell them what, it might even include what happens if it doesn't, if the developer is not doing anything or it's not working or whatever. The local authority might have powers to step in and do things itself to create this habitat and keep it going.
Now, you mentioned that there's an alternative to local planning authorities. BNG can also be administered by responsible bodies. Can you tell us what is a responsible body, and are the duties the same? How do they differ?
Yes, sure. So this is a new concept also introduced by the Environment Act 2021 of a thing called a conservation covenant. So in general, that has a wider application than just biodiversity net gain. It's for any environmental agreement to do something with land for an environmental purpose generally, but BNG will be one of its main uses. So you, the landowner or the developer, enter into it with a new concept of a body called a responsible body. So it's a bit like the local authority for a Section 106 agreement, but it is this new style of agreement. As I said, there are not very many responsible bodies declared so far. You can look them up on the internet. At the moment, there are 2 local authorities, Northumberland and Bracknell Forest, have decided to become responsible bodies. 2 private companies, RSK Biocensus and Harry something Holdings in the Isle of Wight, whose name escapes me, and Natural England have also become one, but they have said they won't do it for BNG because they are running the whole regime and it would be a bit of a conflict. So the advantage of this is that if you're getting nowhere with getting a Section 106 agreement with your local authority, you could try one of these instead, and they will operate anywhere in the country. Although the 2 local authorities have said they prefer to operate near where they operate, their land is. So that may give you an alternative if you're getting frustrated, and it may also help keep the costs down, because if the local authority is charging too much, you say, well, I'll go to this responsible body, they're only charging X, and they say, oh, all right, we'll only charge you a bit more than X or whatever. So hopefully that'll inject a bit of economic competition into this area.
Okay, thank you. We've heard the term Section 106 a couple of times today and in previous episodes, but can you explain what a Section 106 is and how it is generally used?
Yes, of course. So what section is it of? It's of the Town and Country Planning Act 1990. Section 106 is what's called a planning obligation. So usually they are used for the developer to pay somebody, usually the local authority, to do something to offset an impact of the development. So say there's a new supermarket near a roundabout, and all the extra traffic using the supermarket is going to clog up the roundabout. So the Section 106 agreement might say the developer is going to pay £1 million to the local authority or the highway authority or somebody who's going to enlarge the roundabout to stop all that congestion. So it's when it's land that the developer it's not in their control, so they can't do it themselves. They will pay money to somebody, and that makes the development acceptable. And so the combination of the Planning Commission and the Section 106 agreement make it all okay.
Okay, and how is that then applied for biodiversity then?
Well, this is the promise to create and then maintain habitat for 30 years will be the subject of can be included in or as its own Section 106 agreement when the developer is doing it on their own land within the development site. I mean, you might think developers might not want to do that because they'll have to use up some of their site for habitat and they want to build all over it. But there are some habitats like green roofs and green walls that count for biodiversity purposes that wouldn't mean that any buildings would have to be smaller or that sort of thing. So there are options in urban environments for creating new habitat.
And so the Section 106 effectively pins the plan, which says what will be created, enhanced, how it be monitored, maintained for 30 years. And it's essentially a contract, isn't it, with local planning authorities to legitimise those BNG units on site or indeed off site if it's a habitat bank.
Yes, that's right. So it's to capture that promise to do it, essentially, and put you on the hook for it.
Do responsible bodies have the option of issuing the same thing, or so? What's
Yes,
the difference with the conservation covenant?
well, their legal derivation is different, but I think their contents will be pretty much the same for biodiversity net gain and whether they're Section 106 agreements or conservation covenants. They'll just be being entered into with a different party.
Okay. So turning to developers, we have talked about BNG obligations and with local planning authorities, responsible bodies. What specific legal documents do they need to gain consent?
Okay, so as I said, when they make the application on the standard planning application form has now been extended, so it's got a question on biodiversity net gain, and it says, do you think you are exempt? And if you say yes, then it says, which exemption are you claiming you're under, and give us reasons why. And if you say you're not exempt, then you have to give all the how many units of the habitats on your land. I haven't actually mentioned about all these the biodiversity metric and units, but perhaps your listeners are familiar with that already, but I can explain that if you like. So you do all that. So at the time of the application, then there's this biodiversity gain plan before you can commence the development. And if you're providing you the developer yourself are providing the biodiversity on site, you will have to have a Section 106 agreement or a conservation covenant. If it's off-site, then someone else will be doing that, but you will probably need an agreement with that other party to get them to make sure it's your development they're going to use their units for, and for you to pay them the money to do it for the 30 years. So there are going to be a few non-planning contracts flying around as well, probably.
That's what I was
And
going to
then,
ask you. So do you
yeah.
need a legal document to say I've purchased a particular set of units from a provider? Is that how that works?
Well, there'll be some sort of agreement to allow the money to be paid to the provider, but the way it's recorded is there's this national register of biodiversity land, and it'll say one particular parcel of land has 30 units on it, and you, a developer, are going to use 10 of them. It'll say that 10 of the units have now been used up for this development, and it will be recorded openly like that. And it costs money it costs £45 to allocate your development to somebody on the register, and £639 to put the entry in the register in the first place. It's quite expensive.
And just out of curiosity, then, what happens should a developer need to change a development plan then after BNG plan's been approved? Can it be amended, or do they need to start again?
I guess it depends whether the change to their project affects what they were going to do with the habitat. If they're doing something else, but the habitat effects are still the same, then they can probably keep going with the same Section 106 agreement and so on. If they want to do something different, then they will have to renegotiate a new agreement, probably start again with a new planning application, which is going to take a lot of time and money, so probably best avoided if you can help it, and better to get it right in the first place, I would have thought. Oh, what was the £45 for? This is if you are a developer using someone else's biodiversity units that are on this national register, to allocate your development to those units costs you, the developer, £45.
Which may not be too bad.
No, that's not too expensive.
So let me run a scenario past you. What happens if a project has all the necessary approvals, planning consent, BNG plans in place, makes a start? Let's assume that they've actually started construction, so land has been turned over, so to speak. If the project stalls, what happens next? And if the project needs to be changed or sold at that point, who has the BNG obligations? I'm sure there's numerous project change scenarios. How are those managed
Yes.
from a biodiversity perspective?
Well, if the project stalls, as things would stand, if there's a Section 106 agreement or a conservation, every time I say Section 106 agreement, assume I've said or a conservation covenant from now on. If there's a Section 106 agreement, then that would still be committing the landowner to creating and maintaining this habitat. So if they stop doing anything, including building the development and building the habitat, they would be in breach of that agreement. So they might want to try and negotiate that away, agree with the local authority that they don't need to do it anymore. But if they don't do anything, then they will be breaching that agreement. So whereas if it's secured by planning condition attached to the planning permission, that might be a bit easier to stop doing it because conditions are less sort of entrenched, signed and sealed than Section 106 agreements.
And can the obligations be transferred to another party?
Well, Section 106 agreements are described as running with the land. So that means if the landowner changes, it automatically transfers to the new landowner, and conservation covenants will be like that as well. So there'll always be someone, because you can never have land that isn't owned by anyone, there'll always be someone on the hook for the biodiversity net gain obligation.
Okay. And if a project's delayed, is there any impact at all if it takes presumably more than 30 years to deliver? Is there any ramifications there from the Section 106 agreement perspective?
If they've already created the habitat and maintained it for the 30 years, then that would be okay. That would fulfill the obligation, even if they haven't even finished the development by then. That's all they're saying they're going to do, is have a new habitat for 30 years.
Okay, so if a developer
right.
has excess BNG units on the site, how can they transfer those units to other development sites? What's the legal process that they should follow?
Yes, that is a very good point, because it's one, I mean, it all seems sort of new burdens on developers and new costs, but this is one glimmer of a potential advantage, is that if you can design your project so that you provide more than 10% biodiversity net gain on site, you can just allocate the first 10% to your project and then put the rest on this register, just like a landowner can do. And then it can be allocated to someone else's development, who will then pay you for your units that are on the register, and you can offset some of the cost of your development that way. An interesting example that seems to be very easy to have a high level of BNG is a solar farm, because you've got your panels sitting on the ground, and the ground is used to be usually just crops, agricultural fields, which have a fairly low value. But if you turn them into something more rich environmentally, like a sort of wildflower meadow or something, you can get a huge number of biodiversity units while also having your development, and then allocate all the surplus units to other people's developments and offset quite a considerable part of your cost of your project.
Am I right in thinking the process for landowners is the same if they intend to simply just sell units?
Nearly the same. So if you're a landowner and you have some unproductive land, or not sufficiently productive land, that you are prepared to tie up for this 30 years, plus any time it takes to create the habitat, then this could be an opportunity to make some money. So what you do is you don't have the option of a planning condition, because there's not necessarily, you probably won't be a planning application to create the habitat. You're just planting some seeds or trees or something, but you still have to agree to create and then maintain the habitat for 30 years, which you can do either the Section 106 agreement or the Conservation Covenant. And once you've done that, you can put it on this national register so that everyone can see it. Or what's probably more likely in most cases is you find a developer before you put it on the register, before you make the commitment to create this habitat for 30 years, because otherwise there's a risk you might create it, spend lots of money making this lovely habitat, and no developer ever comes along to give you money to pay for it. So it'd be advisable on the whole, although I think there's going to be much more demand for sites than there is supply at the beginning, at least. Wait till you have a developer and then do it all at the same time, that you enter into your Section 106, put it on the register, and immediately allocate it to that development. I'm having great difficulty persuading local authorities to understand this type of Section 106 agreement for a landowner, because every other one up to now in history has always been attached to a planning application or planning permission, and this one isn't attached to it. It's just by itself promising this 30-year habitat enhancement, and many of them don't understand that. I've written to every local authority in England to ask for their biodiversity details and any templates they have developed. And out of 327, I've had 5 have got a template. So that shows the level of readiness for this, possibly. Some are pretty switched on, I have to say. It's not all doom and gloom, but some just don't seem to get that this is a new kind of agreement.
So it seems okay for if you're a developer and you're doing it on site, but if you're an environment bank, effectively trying to create something and sell it, that's where this particular 106 agreement becomes a bit more challenging for now. And hopefully that's a temporary thing, right? Can we talk a
Yes.
little bit about the contract between developers and I put down in my notes landowners, but what I'm really thinking here is property developer, land managers is what I have in mind. So BNG maintenance can often be in place for a long period of time on site. How do developers or landowners, manage that liability when the property is sold? So have in mind here, if you're at a housing estate with an area of conservation associated with the property itself, and obviously the developer is going to sell the properties and has a land manager in place. Who maintains that responsibility for the on-site development?
Well, as I've said, the Section 106 agreement obligations run with the land. So if the developer sells the land to a management company, which
Transfer
may be a sort of joint between all the landowners, say there are 20 houses on a site, 20 individual owners, and they all have this management company that owns the freehold of the land, and they each have a share in it or something, then I'm afraid that company will have this obligation to maintain the habitat. That is why I think, particularly for house builders, the off-site option might be more attractive, because then once this biodiversity gain plan has been agreed with the local authority and they can commence the development, they are no longer on the hook for the habitat. That is where the off-site, the owner of that land over there, it's their problem now. Having said that, there is this thing called the biodiversity net gain hierarchy, which you're supposed to go through and step by step in deciding what you're going to do. So, and the first option is to look on site. So you've got to demonstrate the reasonable satisfaction of the local authority you can't do it on site first, before you're allowed to go off site. And then if you can't even find off-site land, we haven't actually mentioned biodiversity credits, which is the last resort where you throw money at the problem. Shall I say a bit more about those now? Yeah. So there are essentially three options. There's on-site BNG, where you, the developer, create the habitat and maintain it. Off-site, where you might have some other land of your own somewhere else, or generally you'll be paying some other landowner or broker to enhance some land. But if you can't find either of those options, and maybe you've got a particular rare habitat or something, or there just aren't very many sites. I mean, the National Register only has a princely amount of 2 sites on it at the moment, 2 months after the regime came into being. Then you have an option of buying what are called biodiversity credits from the government. But the government has set the prices of these deliberately high so that it doesn't interfere with this market of buying and selling biodiversity units that they're hoping will be created, and seems to be slowly being created. So the minimum cost of one unit for the least valuable habitat is £84,000, and the most expensive one is £1.3 million for just one biodiversity unit of a peat lake. So don't build on a peat lake is my message to you, because that could be very, very expensive.
Wow,
and it's probably not very suitable for building on anyway, but
I can't imagine so. What's the ideal process?
So there is a last resort always available.
Yeah. Is there an ideal process to mitigate the risk for developers? What should they avoid doing, and what should they do? What's the recommended course of action?
Well, the advantage of doing it all on site, it is all within the developer's control, and this is probably the cheapest option. But if they want to subsequently sell a reasonably clean title to somebody else who you're not going to saddle with a 30-year obligation to maintain a habitat, then the off-site option might be attractive, because you can either, it's up to you entirely between you and the landowner how you agree to pay money, but you could do it all in one go at the beginning, and then you completely out of the picture for the 30 years. or you could have an ongoing, maybe you can't afford to do that right at the beginning, sort of you pay an annual amount or something. But the first option is probably the lowest risk in the sense that you don't have to even think about this land anymore.
Yep.
Very low risk, but very high cost is buying these credits, because all you do is give money to the government. Behind the scenes, they apparently will enhance some habitat with that money, but you don't even know where it is or anything. And so you just wash your hands of it all. So it's a balance between cost and risk, basically, as always.
Have we missed anything? Have we, and anything that we should have raised for our audience today? Opportunities that you see for developers, landowners to deliver biodiversity benefits in perhaps the right way?
What we haven't really covered in any detail is the way but the units are calculated. And it is worth, as a developer or a landowner, appreciating what factors affect the number of units a habitat creates. I mean, I can very briefly, you multiply four things together. One is the area of the land in hectares. One is a figure associated with the type of habitat. It's called its distinctiveness. And there's options 0, 2, 4, 6, or 8, depending. So there is a 0 if it's just total concreted over and nothing growing there at all, up to very rare habitats at 8. And then an ecologist has to tell you what condition the habitat is in, and that's 1, 2, or 3 for poor, medium, or good. And finally, if the habitat is rare enough to be mentioned as worth keeping in the local plan, you multiply it by 1.15, a little bit more. So you multiply those four things together, and that gives you the number in units. So it's definitely worth, if you have a choice of site as a developer to where to build, assessing what the different habitats on the different options are, because it could really make a difference to the cost of the development. Yeah, so I think it's worth appreciating those factors.
Thank you, Angus. So I'm going to summarize, then bring us to some questions we've picked up in the chat function on the Q&A and the ones we raised in advance. But just to summarize, most project developments will require to deliver a mandated biodiversity net gain if the project is impacting on a habitat greater than 5 meters by 5 meters, and the development is not considered self-build. Some local authorities may require more than 10%, but it's being discouraged. BNG is, in addition to existing environmental obligations, you have to do the same protected species and impact assessments if you had to do them before. Developers will be expected to provide a commitment for 30 years on the development, including monitoring and management for the habitats being established or enhanced. In some cases, this may be part of planning condition for very small basic habitats, but the majority are expected to go through a Section 106 agreement with a local planning authority or a conservation covenant with a responsible body. Off-site developments are expected to be registered with the National Registrar. This may include excess units from a development that is intended to be used for other nearby projects or intended to be sold. And if you are buying a unit from the market or statutory credits from the central government, the liability for 30-year commitment resides with the seller, not with the buyer. So first of all, thank you, Angus, for today's discussion. I'm going to turn ourselves to some of the questions. I'm going to start with some of the ones which came through in advance, and then which will give me an opportunity to have a quick look at the ones in the chat function. But let's start with this one, which was many agents would submit applications as self and custom build in homes in order to mitigate against BNG 10% for smaller sites. You know, what is the advice around how that quirk of the rules has been identified, and how do you manage against it?
Well, yes, it is true that any self-build or custom build projects of 9 or fewer dwellings are exempt, but there is a legal definition for that. You can't just say, oh, this is self-build and hope that they believe you. I did read it in advance, having seen that question in advance, and it is basically an individual or group of individuals who want to build the property themselves and live in it themselves. So I suppose they could subsequently sell it to somebody else, but I think their intention, at least initially, is that they will live in it themselves. I'm sure there will be people looking to get around the rules and maybe try and use that one more creatively, but they will have to comply with that legal definition.
I'm going to ask you this one, which was in the chat function early on. So he said, you mentioned that you could pay someone else to enhance the habitat. The habitat may fall in another area. Is it mandated that that area for enhancement is situated in the UK? And let me ask, in addition to that, and in England, or nearby to the local planning authority site?
The first answer is it must be in England. This regime only applies in England so far, and all the land must be in England as well. It's worth noting, I didn't completely tell you about everything to do with the biodiversity metric for scoring units. And those 4 initial things were for the land you're about to use up. For the new land, it's the same 4 things, but then there are discounts for how long it's going to take to create the habitat, how difficult it is to create the habitat, which are those 2 are both hard coded into the metric. But the final one is, where is this habitat compared with your development? And there's a fairly crude discount, but if it's anywhere in the same local planning authority or a thing called the same national character area, and there are maps of those if you look them up, then it doesn't affect the score. If they're in the neighboring one, then you multiply by 3/4 your score. And if they're anywhere further away in England, then you multiply by 1/2. So if your development is in Cornwall, if the site is anywhere else in Cornwall, that's fine. If it's in West Devon, then it'll be 3/4. If it's anywhere further away, it doesn't matter whether it's in the Lake District or in Dorset, you'll need twice as much land because of that figure.
Okay.
So it does matter where the site is, but it can be anywhere in England.
I think somebody's put in here, my understanding is double units are needed if you go down the government unit option as well. Is that correct? Statutory credits?
I think I know what that means, what you're getting at. If you search for credit prices, remember I said it's £84,000 for 1 unit. If you look up the credit price, it will say it's £42,000 for a credit. But then you read the small print, it says you need 2 credits for every unit. So it's like, reminds me of snacks that are trying to sound healthier than they are. They say there are 2 servings, so they halve the number of calories per serving, make it look smaller. Yeah, so you need to double all the numbers in the list of credit prices to convert it to units.
So so the answer there is yes, it automatically assumes the same for the spatial discount, and the credits effectively it is double.
The credits you don't you don't know where this land is that they're going to enhance is. There's just that single price. It doesn't get discounted any further.
Okay, thank you. Let me jump back to these questions here. How can we as LPAs ensure such loopholes? And this was going back to the self-build designated, how they define themselves as custom build. How as an LPA can we ensure such loopholes are not exposed for BNG for small and medium sites?
Well, it's difficult to tell the difference between someone who is genuinely intending to live in the house that they've just built, but then sells it, compared with someone who never really wanted to and was just pretending they were going to. I mean, it's just a sort of question of believing the assurances of the developer, I suppose. But there are going to be things at the edges of this regime, just like any regime, which are going to be difficult.
Okay. And I think there was a flurry of these questions which came from the local planning authorities. We had, we've answered this question before already. Is it possible to propose 10% BNG for development and then increase the percentage to create BNG units that could be put in the marketplace all at the same time on the same land? I think the answer to that is
well, you the developer can have as many percentages as you like. As a local planning policy, the authorities are discouraged from having more than 10% as their own policies. But some manage to jump the gun and have like 20% or something. Like Cambridge, I think, is one of them.
Okay. The follow-on question to that one was, could you say a little bit more about the legal requirements for local planning authority side for third-party habitat banks in the borough and the habitat banks set up by the local planning authority itself?
Yes, of course. So this is essentially off-site land where it's just landowners offering land. You, the local planning authority, will need, well, if they choose the Section 106 route, the landowner, you will enter into it with them, and that'll set out the details of monitoring management of the site and how much money you're going to charge them for doing that. To reduce cost and officer time, I would suggest you put in obligations to report on the state of the habitat during its creation and then afterwards during its maintenance. So to put the obligation on the landowner to tell you what's going on, I mean, you will need to check, obviously, but that will mean you have to do a bit less checking yourself. But they might avoid you altogether and use a conservation covenant with some other party, and then you won't be involved at all. So if you want to do it, then you could tout yourselves as being interested and being reasonably cheap. And if you don't want to do it, you can tell them to find a responsible body, I guess.
Fabulous. The next one here is, how is the priority habitat and statutory protected habitats taken account for within the metric?
Yes, if you remember back in the, no, maybe I didn't actually say this explicitly. When that de minimis exemption, that means too small, of 25 square meters, that only applies if the distinctiveness of the habitat isn't one of the highest ones. So if you're covering destroying a rare habitat, however small it is, you will have to provide BNG. Priority habitat covers basically the high and very high distinctiveness habitats in the metric. And so they are a bit special that they mean you can't rely on that exemption. Other protected landscapes and areas of outstanding natural beauty, triple SIs, any obligation a development has to protect those or not be seen from them or whatever will still continue separately to BNG.
So there was one question which came from the chat function. What happens
Mhm.
if the development doesn't achieve the predicted BNG habitats, doesn't achieve the predicted condition after 30 years? So it's what if you fail your Section 106 agreement, essentially?
Well, there's a slight misunderstanding potentially in that question that the 30 years starts only after you have finished creating the habitat. So the metric will tell you, we think it takes 10 years to create an orchard in moderate condition or something. So you will have 10 years to do that, and then your 30 years only starts then. So you will in fact be tying up the land for 40 years in that case, because it's 10 years to create it and then 30 years to maintain it. So make sure you remember to add the time it takes to create. But if you're failing, this will probably be in your Section 106 agreement what happens. So if it's not, there may be sort of milestones to tick off as you go through that, say it's that 10-year orchard. Have the trees been planted? Are they all still alive after 3 years, and so on? And are they growing to the right? And if it's not happening, then you'll have a plan that you probably agreed with the local authority of what to do in those situations. So you may have extra steps you have to take, or even the local authority might step in, or the responsible body step in and do things itself and then charge you for the privilege. And that's quite likely to be built into the Section 106 agreement. So there'll be ways around, but you can't use up your 30 years just creating the habitat. The 30 years won't start until it's created.
Gotcha. And essentially the ramifications, the consequences of not complying is actually part of your Section 106. That is something which is kind of drafted
Yes, that
already.
will be
So
built
that will
into
kick
there.
in. Yeah. The question went on from there. So what about if you lease the land that you were looking to plant on? If the lease of the land is in excess of that time period, would we need the landowner's permission? Where would we get the money from? Not sure we can answer that one. Do you think leaseholder is something we could look at doing? Is that an option? Could you lease land for a long period of time instead of buying it outright?
I mean, you may already have a lease of land, as long as it's long enough for the time to create the habitat and then plus the 30 years and won't expire during that period. Then, and the terms of your lease might prevent you from doing certain things on the land. You may have agreed with the freeholder you can't do it, but so you need to check that as well. But provided that's all above board, then you should be able to do it yourself as a leaseholder. Or you could create a new lease. And I think that's what some of these brokers are insisting, that they lease the land from the landowner and handle all the habitat creation themselves. I think that's partly because a Section 106 agreement is entered into with someone with an interest in the land. So if they have a lease, then they will be a party to that agreement. Whereas if they don't, then they won't. But you don't necessarily, if you're the body creating the habitat, you don't necessarily have to have a lease of the land. So there are various options available, but you would need a long enough lease
to cover it. Yep.
to cover it all.
So there was maybe a clarification question here, I think, when we was talking about the credits. So you said, so they was may I just check that it has to be a like-for-like habitat loss replacement. If I build on a species-rich grassland, BNG units need to be species-rich grassland. So I think that comes down to trading rules. It might be
Yes,
worth
we have. Yep.
that.
Got 4 minutes left. So there are certain rules about what type of habitat the replacement habitat can be compared with the habitat that you're using up. They get stricter as you go up the distinctiveness scale. So the lowest, well, 0 distinctiveness you don't care about at all because that doesn't score anything. But the low distinctiveness of distinctiveness 2, any habitat of 2 or more will do. Doesn't matter what it is. If you go up to 4, that's medium, then it must be what's called the same broad type of habitat. So if you're using up a grassland type habitat, you've got to create a grassland, but it could be a different type of grassland. Then when you get up to 6, you have to replace it with the same habitat. And then when you get to 8, the highest one, you have to agree bespoke arrangements because it's such a rare habitat, you're going to have to do something really complicated. So it gets stricter as you go up. And so your development site may have a mixture of different levels, and you can be freer with part of it if it's lower distinctiveness and more strict as for the other part. So you'll need to be aware of all that, I'm afraid.
No problem. I'm going to ask just one last question, and then I think we're at the top of time here. So probably one which is very relevant to other obligations that developers have with properties. How do we ensure sustainable urban drainage systems benefits are prioritised through BNG? I know that they're in the metric as defined habitats effectively, aren't they?
Well, I'm not sure that they are actually recognised habitats under BNG. I mean, sustainable urban drainage is a separate concept of making sure that your land can drain without, through the ground, without it going into the pipes and into the sewer system, which is sort of less green, essentially. But you could probably fulfill SUDS, as it's shortened to, obligations with some sort of creation of grassland or some. Most habitats will allow such drainage, so you can usually probably think about those at the same time and find something that works for both obligations.
So that's another one of those opportunities where you're combining an
Yes.
obligation to do grey water, effectively drainage, not sewage, into SUBs, but actually that is part of your conservation build, and you can also incorporate into BNG. Thank you, Angus. Thank you so much, and thank you for the audience attend today. We're at the top of the hour, so we're going to call it a close for this one. And please come and join me again in a month's time on Sustainability Superheroes. Thank you, Angus. Take care.
Thank you very much, everyone. Hope you found that useful. Goodbye.
Thank you.